The Hutchison Effect, an overview by George D. Hathaway, Professional Engineer at Hathaway Consulting Services in Toronto, Canada, on May 14th, 1993.
Hello, my name is George Hathaway. We're in the Toronto laboratory of Hathaway Consulting Services. And this lab that you see around you is set up to investigate new concepts in physics and engineering, especially those that are directly related to novel energy and propulsion technologies. By far the most advanced and unusual such non-conventional energy technology that I have ever witnessed is the Hutchison Effect. This video will try to document Hutchison's research and suggest basic physical theories which might help understand and explain what I have called the Hutchison Effect. Much of the work at this laboratory in Toronto is meant to try to help investigate and elucidate the physics underlying the Hutchison Effect. This presentation will be divided into several different sections, each of which will proceed more or less chronologically. The first section will describe what is meant by the Hutchison Effect itself and give a brief background. Next, you'll see some of the early film footage that was taken by myself and mostly by John Hutchison late at night, from 1980 to 1985 timeframe. Then I shall discuss my personal involvement with John Hutchison via a company that was set up to understand and try to develop the Hutchison Effect. Following this, you'll see later results from the 1988 to 1989 timeframe, a point at which John was involved with another company in Vancouver, British Columbia. In 1988, I formally presented the Hutchison Effect at an international symposium on new energy technology, which was held in Hull, Quebec, Canada. And at that time, I suggested that several physicists whose work should be investigated be contacted to see whether they could help to understand what is going on. But I also appealed to scientists generally to help to elucidate the concepts and the physics behind the Hutchison Effect. Finally, I'll conclude with a summary of the Hutchison Effect, giving possible and potential applications of the effect, and providing some future directions and recommendations.
The Hutchison Effect. Part A, Description of Effects. Part B, Background. Part C, Early Results, Film and Samples. Part D, Business Involvement plus Demonstrations. And then Part E, Later Results plus Demonstrations. Part F, 1988 New Energy Tech Symposium. Part G, Related Physics. And then Part H, conclusions. The Hutchison Effect. Part A, Description of Effects. Materials fracturing, plasticization, levitation, hovering and translation, luminescent phenomena, magnetic phenomena, other anomalous phenomena, all at low average power and at a distance.
This section shows the various aspects of catastrophic disruption of materials, just one of a number of different kinds of effects that are possible with the Hutchison apparatus, and will serve to introduce the various other forms of unusual energetic activity which occur when the Hutchison apparatus is operating. There are a number of different kinds of effects that the Hutchison apparatus is capable of, including the kinds of severe disruption and catastrophic fracturing of materials you see in front of me here, as well as other unusual lifting and levitation phenomena, including the levitation of objects of virtually any material weighing up to 20 to 30 kilograms, and the kinds of lifting and movement phenomena can be divided into several categories, which you will see in the various film clips that will be presented during this video. Some of those are divided into categories such as the sudden taking off of rather heavy materials in a powered takeoff mode, the hovering mode where material objects will sit and hover mid-air, a slow looping arc, almost like to say a Coriolis arc, and a translation sideways, or pressing down, in fact. Along with those levitation and molecular disruption phenomena, there are a number of other apparently unrelated phenomena that occur with the Hutchison Effect apparatus, including unusual luminescent phenomena, as well as plasticization of materials not quite fracturing, such as you see here, and other phenomena including magnetic anomalies and unusual pressure effects, all capable of being produced by the Hutchison apparatus at low average power and at a distance from the material itself. My involvement in the Hutchison Effect stems from an early discussion with John Hutchison in 1981 and has carried on in various forms until the present day. The Hutchison Effect, to me, still represents the most unusual congregation of activity in one general setup that I've ever witnessed, and I hope that this video will help others to understand the breadth of phenomena going on in the Hutchison Effect, as well as stimulate them to try and duplicate the effect, as well as to promote the beneficial use of the technology for future generations. The effect itself will be shown in these videos and the clips that you're about to see, spanning the time period from 1981 to 1989, and most of the phenomena that you see have taken place in the laboratories, various laboratories of John Hutchison through this time period in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. You will see various samples, as you're seeing now, as well as still photos and video clips, both from Super 8 videos, Super 8 films, rather, and videos made during the operation of the Hutchison apparatus during its transformations from its earliest stages in 1981 to its last incarnation in 1989.
The Hutchison Effect, Part B, Background, Self-Educated Experimenter, Early Interest in Nikola Tesla, First Effects in Basement, Added Van de Graaff to 2 Tesla coils, by 1981 Stabilized and Enhanced Activity.
John Hutchison has a long history of experimentation with various kinds of scientific and electrical apparatus. He lives in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada at the moment, and he started his career in electrical tinkering, you might say, at a very early age. He collected very many forms of early electrical apparatus, from Morse code sets to Army surplus oscillators and vacuum tube voltmeters and various pieces of equipment that he was able to obtain very inexpensively at local surplus places. And he would build up a number of pieces of apparatus, and his aim was to try to duplicate the effects of the turn-of-the-century physicist and scientist and electrical experimenter Nikola Tesla, who was one of his great heroes. Tesla had a number of important inventions to his credit, including the transmission of electrical energy without wires. Hutchison was involved with attempting to do that kind of experiment, where one piece of apparatus is in one location, separated by a distance from another piece, and the attempt would be to send electrical energy through the atmosphere from one piece of apparatus to another. Generally, these pieces of apparatus are termed Tesla coils, and John Hutchison had an early interest in trying to send electrical energy without wires from one location to the other, as Tesla had attempted to do at the turn of the century. He had a great love of Tesla and had amassed a number of Tesla coils and made quite a few, as well as his early interest in high-voltage electrostatic machines. And it was during the repair of one of these electrostatic machines, a Van de Graaff generator was called, for a friend of his, that he started to observe unusual phenomena in his basement laboratory in Vancouver. John himself is a self-educated experimenter. He has not had university education, but he has a great innate feel for electrical energy flows around him. He is a highly sensitive individual who is capable of discerning very subtle changes in the electrostatic and apparently the electromagnetic field around him. In this way, he is able to pinpoint areas of specific and unusual activity in his laboratory and try to enhance the effect that that particular spot may have on objects that are placed in the field of his devices. He showed several of these Tesla coils at various science fairs in Vancouver prior to 1981, and during a demonstration of one of these Tesla coils at a science fair, an associate of mine, Alexis Pezarro, became involved with the Hutchison phenomenon and John Hutchison himself, and that started a long involvement with a number of people, including myself, through Alexis Pezarro on the West Coast in Vancouver. John was a great collector of early and wartime Army surplus electronic apparatus, and had a lab completely full of electronic apparatus from wartime years, and a number of pieces of apparatus, a great number, in fact, that he produced himself. Hand-wound coils and pieces of specially machined tubing and material that would try to enhance this effect that he apparently had discovered with a number of his different kinds of materials that he would find in various surplus electronic places. He had always had a long and long involvement with Tesla coil research and a great love of the work of turn-of-the-century physicist Nikola Tesla, as you'll see throughout this video. And the first effect that he was able to put down as the starting point of the Hutchison effect occurred in the early part of, I believe, 1980, and it occurred when he introduced a Van de Graaff electrostatic generator into an assemblage of equipment which was primarily composed of two Tesla coils separated by some 6 to 8 feet. Upon the introduction of the electrostatic machine, the Van de Graaff generator, odd things started to happen, including phenolic blocks floating around and pieces of material flopping about. And these were then documented in 1981 by John Hutchison and a bit by myself and Alexis Pezarro. And this started off the most unusual history of the Hutchison effect itself, and finally he was able to stabilize the effect after it got off to a rather shaky start. And so in the video clips that you'll see in a moment, in the next section, you'll see some of the apparatus in action in its most stable form. And later on toward the end of the decade, in 1988, 1989, he was able again to stabilize the apparatus enough that he was able to produce a series of effects that proved beyond the question that we were dealing with a highly unusual piece of apparatus and collection of material. What I'm going to show now is an early video clip of the outside of John's 1981 Vancouver laboratory in the basement of a house in which he was staying.
Through to the lab. It's an impossible beat, by the way. We're looking straight into the lab. There's the main control panel at the bottom. The Van de Graaff, the ballast. Now a quick pan on the inside of the lab. There's the variometer, the large 8-inch coil, the smaller choke, another choke, and a view now of the main power supply area showing the spiral spark gap, various toroids, and other components. We'll now pan across the ceiling to the dumbbell-shaped coil, the big RF coil, small spark gap, the main ballast, the main Tesla coil with a small variometer behind it. There's the main Tesla coil, the bottom of the ballast and the Van de Graaff. There's the Van de Graaff. And finally we have a shot of the bottom, the base of the Tesla coil, with the ring, bronze ring on the primary, with the tubes, and back. And John, you're going to wave to the audience? There's John! And that's also the big coil, big capacitor. So that's it.
The Hutchison Effect, Part C, Early Results from 1981 to 1983. 8mm film footage, basement laboratory, first effects, samples, and other witnesses.
The earliest results in which I was involved, along with Alexis Pezarro, with John Hutchison, occurred in the 1981 to 1983 time frame. And in a few minutes I'm going to show a video clip of some very early Hutchison experiments from that time period. In his very first laboratory, a video clip of which you have just seen, in fact, it was converted from Super 8 film a few minutes ago. And what we'll see is some of the very first documentation that John took of the Hutchison effect in action. In particular, you'll see the levitation of objects as well as the breaking apart of solid objects and unusual lighting phenomena. These occurred in the basement of a house in which he was living, and they occurred sporadically throughout a 6-month time period. And this was one of the big problems with the Hutchison effect, and still remains to this day, the extremely transitory nature of the phenomenon. One would have to sit with John and the apparatus for days and days on end before one was able to compile a reasonable documentary amount of evidence to show the phenomena in action. And this was compounded by the fact that the Hutchison apparatus, being a rather sparky and RF generating a piece of set of apparati, would disrupt television sets and radio, cause intense radio frequency interference in a radius of about half a mile around the apparatus. Therefore, John had to run the apparatus late at night. In fact, it was generally between 11:30 and 12 and about 5:30 and 6 in the morning that he had to operate the apparatus. And since the effects occurred very transitorily, it was impossible to sit there long enough to be guaranteed a video, a taping, or a film taping of a particular event that you wanted to see. Therefore, John would sit with the apparatus and basically sleep during the day and do his experiments at night. And we set him up with a camera, Alexis Pezarro and myself, a Super 8 camera, and said, "Go to it, John. Here's a tripod, etc." Put the camera on the tripod and aim it at the area in the apparatus from which these objects take place. And that's what he did. And the next film footage you'll see is converted from Super 8mm film footage taken in 1981. And it shows a number of interesting phenomena in the earliest incarnation of the Hutchison effect apparatus in the laboratory you just saw the clip of a short while ago. Next, we will go to some miscellaneous footage from the basement, including other witnesses that were around during the 1981 to 1983 time period and actually saw the effects for themselves, including myself. Following that, I shall show you a close-up series of shots of some samples that I have that John kindly provided me with, and show you some of the unique features of these samples that have been blown apart and disrupted in various ways. I must stress that the phenomena is very transitory in nature and still remains transitory up to the very last incarnations of the apparatus. That was 1989, and it was never possible to predict with accuracy exactly when a particular phenomenon would take place. One would have to wait anywhere from 1 to 2 hours, perhaps a half an hour at the best. That was in the 1988-1989 time frame, to maybe 6 hours to 12 hours between phenomena, because the apparatus and perhaps John's interaction with it was so highly transitory. This, of course, made any normal video documentation or recording of the apparatus in action very frustrating, in that you could never predict with certainty when a particular activity was going to take place. Not only that, it was virtually impossible to predict whether a test object was going to physically take off or hover or press down or disintegrate. It was not possible during your early trials to predict what was going to happen to the actual pieces of test apparatus. It also must be stressed that the whole apparatus, in its early phase, namely the 1981 to 1983 timeframe, which we were about to see, was powered from single 110 volt, 10 amp to 15 amp wall socket, and it's therefore characterized by having a very low average power consumption. But since it did have storage capacitors and inductors in the circuit of the apparatus itself, there were some high stored energy components that were released explosively through various spark gaps. The details of the apparatus will be discussed a little bit later, and they can be found in a presentation I made in a symposium in 1988 in Hull, Quebec. The apparatus contained many spark gaps, coils, as you saw in the clip just a few minutes ago, and a few capacitors and things of that nature. And the video that you're about to see, the clip you're about to see, is translated, as I say, from 8mm film footage, and shows a number of effects, but very close on. Unfortunately, John was holding the camera with one hand and adjusting the apparatus with the other hand, and so the camera kind of moves around, and he unfortunately was quite close on and zoomed into the active area rather than pulling back to see the whole area. In a later clip that I did, you'll see the general setup where these effects took place. In fact, they took place on a board, a plywood board, that was supported between two lathes, metal cutting lathes that were fairly close together in the laboratory. And the Tesla coils and Van de Graaff generator were off to one side, as you saw in the clip prior to this. So let's now run the earliest 1981 video clip that was converted from 8mm film footage, and we'll see some of the early results.
It's a foam or a small cone.
was produced by the Hutchison apparatus in the form that you see approximately on the board here, and that you saw in the video clip that showed the insides of Hutchison's first 1981 laboratory. There are a number of components that are active in this circuit, and I have put in the block diagram form those components which, in John's and my thinking, were those most responsible for producing the effect. In those days, the effect was called LADS, or LADS, which stood and still stands for Lift and Disruption System. And in its early phase, namely phase 1, the situation was as shown here. This was the situation, the circuit diagram, which we used to try and attract funding for the Hutchison Effect phenomena and the projects that we were hoping with Alexis Pezarro to undertake with John Hutchison. Block schematic is shown here, and it includes this Van de Graaff generator right here. This generator is capable of producing approximately 1.5, perhaps 200,000 volts at microamperes current. There's a small Tesla coil here, which is powered by twin 807 vacuum tube oscillators and produces a very nice, clean spike on the spectrum analysis chart that you'll see later on in this presentation. There's also a spark gap that is continually arcing every 40 seconds or so, fed from a 15 kilovolt DC supply. But that's about a 0.01 microfarad capacitor with a gap, just a wire gap, across the terminals. And the high voltage enters the system, the main system here. It's about 21 kilovolts DC through a number of basically capacitively coupled through a number of toroids and going to a number of other different parts of the circuit. There is a double-ended or dumbbell Tesla coil, which you saw in the previous video clip, a field shaper unit with a coil and basically an aluminum ball with a kind of a halo ring annulus on it. Tank circuits consisting of tuned capacitors and inductors in parallel of your hand. And we also have a main tuning section that is connected to the tank circuits. And the main tuning section consists of a number of high voltage capacitors, up to 15 kilovolt capacitors at a few picofarad. And they control energy flow into the primary of the large Tesla coil. The large Tesla coil, in this case, is about 4.5 feet tall, the secondary, wound with several hundred turns, many hundred turns of fine wire. There are 21 turns on the primary and about 1.5 feet in diameter of number 8 enameled wire. And there's also a ring, a brass ring, around toward the bottom of the large Tesla coil primary, which is fed from one of Tesla's disruptive discharge coils, which is basically a double iron core coil. As well, there is what's known as a snapping gap capacitor, which charges up similar to this one and fires every 30 to 40 seconds. The gap opening is about 1/2 inch or so, and it's fired up to approximately 10 to 15 kilovolts. This alternately charges a toroidal coil around the top of the large Tesla coil, which is not, by the way, connected to any of the secondary or primary. The primary of this large Tesla coil is also powered through a very loose, capacitively coupled set of toroidal coils from the main high voltage supply. However, there is no active powering of the primary of this large Tesla coil. It is powered simply inductively and capacitively, I should say, through the capacitive effects of nearby toroidally shaped coils. At the top, hanging from the ceiling, is what's known as the double-ended Tesla coil, or dumbbell-shaped Tesla coil, with two toroidal primaries. They, in effect, are single-turn primaries, a multiple wrap secondary with two large 6 to 8 inch domes on the end, and those are also connected. The secondary of one of those is connected to this toroidal stack. In a subsequent video clip, we shall see the action of a setup similar to this. This was the very first phase setup that Pharos Technologies, which was Alexis Pezarro and myself, set up to try to duplicate the Hutchison effect with John's assistance. What we have here is a selection of a few of the samples from the early phases of the Hutchison effect in operation, namely the 1981 to 1983 time frame. And these samples show the incredible power that is inherent in the Hutchison effect in terms of breaking apart solid pieces of material, including aluminum, metal, steel, and melting quartz, such as that. The samples that are on the table here generally came from that time period and demonstrate that there's a wide variety of destructive phenomenology associated with the Hutchison effect. This piece here is the same D-shaped piece that lifted off on the video clips that you just saw a moment ago. It weighs about a third to half a pound, and it's a solid steel piece. These pieces are aluminum. You see on the graph paper, here's a scale or a ruler to give you an idea of scale. This piece defoliated, you might say, perhaps along the grain boundaries. It was an extruded piece, and it just delaminated over a period of several minutes. You can see that the surface has undergone a great structural change. It has delaminated and separated in sheets. Some of these sheets were cut off for X-ray fluorescence analyses and for examination by electron microscope. Here's a aluminum piece with some wood that was embedded in it that twisted up while John was watching. There are other aluminum pieces which blasted themselves apart into all sorts of little fibers at the end and suffered incredible damage and contortions in the process. All sorts of little fibers are produced in here, and this is no doubt a bulk phenomenon. It's not a surface phenomenon. Whatever effect is occurring here occurs right through the bulk of the material. Some larger samples include this piece of steel with a chrome alloy finish, and this piece was originally about 3/4 of an inch longer, and the top 3/4 of an inch just blew away into a black cloud. This was while John Hutchison and Alexis Pezarro were observing the effect. There's an interesting pattern here, a conchoidal fracture kind of pattern that appears there, and the case hardening is blown off in various places around here, and evidence of high voltage arcing is there. We've taken off some slices here for elemental analyses. The largest sample that I have is this sample of steel. It's a 2.5 inch in diameter steel shaft piece, and the top of it blew apart and crumbled like a cookie onto the board which was supporting it. And there are all sorts of different fracture patterns there. We'll take a look at some scanning electron micrographs of the surfaces of some of these pieces in a moment. The quartz piece was sitting on a table or on a shelf about 20 feet away from the active area, and it shows elements of melting. There are places where the quartz has shorn off or cleaved very finely, but other places where there's evidence of melting, a severe melting of the quartz. This is perhaps similar to the vitrified stone forts in Scotland. These are other aluminum samples which just split apart. You can see there and there. And finally in this set we see not only a breaking apart of a steel boring bar with the the tool piece still intact, but another interesting set of observations. In this case, the boring bar bent right over to a tight U and broke apart at this rather contorted break. But you can also see, if we can adjust the light sufficiently and zoom in, that there is some very interesting phenomena occurring with regard to any of the alloys that were in situ. In this case, there are globs of copper, pure copper, that have come out of the mix or out of the alloy and deposited themselves at the break. They're visible at the break here. And you can see their little spots of copper-colored material. Strangely enough, when we analyzed the rest of the bar using EDM analysis and XRF analysis, there was no copper present in the alloy. In addition, when we analyzed the content, the elemental content of the pieces that crumbled off of this bar, they were very high in silicon, and yet the rest of the bar had virtually no silicon in it. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get analysis of the bar before the action of the fields took place. I also have some examples of the way the samples were mounted for XRF analysis in the electron microscope. Here's a bit of the aluminum piece that was blown apart, and these are various other samples which we've used and had mounted for elemental and structural analyses. Here is the file that you saw in the video clip before. It broke here and then subsequently broke there and there. And these pieces were magnetized so that when you put them together on a table, they would push themselves apart at the breaks, indicating a north-north, south-south, north-north magnetization, which is quite contrary to the normal occurrence. When you break a bar magnet, you get north-south, and they attract. In this case, these, what you might call apparent monopolar regions, were created and blasted the material apart. And finally, we have another set of examples. Here's a nail that broke apart and dripped down and then dripped upon itself. Here is a screw that bent up quite sharply. And here is an example of the 1/4-inch rat tail file you saw that burnt apart and sparks flew off of it, and other various and sundry pieces. Here is a molybdenum bar that was used that is used for a pin in a nuclear reactor because it does not deform at great heat or at great temperature. And here it is bent, somewhat like a snake. The dots were used for hardness testing, for determining the hardness. In about 1982, the Hutchison Effect was going fairly regularly, and I arranged for Filippo Galuppi of Venus Scientific in Farmington, New York, and a friend of his, Mary, to come up and visit John Hutchison's laboratory along with Alexis Pezarro and witness some of the phenomena in person. And what they saw, and what you'll see in this clip, was a video taken by myself. Actually, it was in Super 8 movie footage of an annulus, a bushing breaking apart, and we just caught the breaking apart in dull light before I was so excited we forgot to turn the main lighting on, but eventually we did, and you can see the bushing has broken apart. It just went pop like that and rolled off, a piece of it rolled off, and it appeared to be slightly magnetized. The remainder of that clip that you're about to see will show various other samples and people holding the samples. And we'll close this section by taking a look at some of the other activity that took place during that time frame, the early setup in Vancouver.
November, we're at John Hutchison's, and we've just witnessed a bursting of this metal. What is it, John? A bushing? Stainless steel bushing. Filippo Galuppi, Alexis Pezarro, John Hutchison, and George Hathaway. Evidence. It's about 3 inches long, 1.5 inch diameter, and beside it is a copper tube. This is as it was found after about 5 minutes of adjusting of the device. That's probably, now there's a bit more light. You can see this thing. And close up. As it was sitting, it appears that the fragments may be a bit magnetized, I'm not sure.
The Hutchison Effect, Part D, Business Involvement and Demonstrations during 1983 to 1986. Involvement of Alexis Pezarro and George Hathaway, formation of Pharos Technologies, setup in temporary lab space, demonstrations for US and Canadian militaries plus government lab personnel, and the end of our formal relationship in 1986.
You're looking at something which you know shouldn't be happening.
Vancouver businessman Alexis Pezarro has seen Hutchison's project in action. In 1981, a company he helped form signed a deal with Hutchison. The company would promote Hutchison's discovery and work to develop it further.
I immediately realized that this had tremendous significance. It had significance in space, it had military implications, and its understanding could possibly open up a whole new energy source.
Associate Pezarro from Vancouver, as he was interviewed during a television spot which talked about the Hutchison Effect some years ago. Pharos Technologies was a company that myself formed in the early 1980s to try to understand what was going on in the Hutchison Effect, the apparatus, to try and duplicate it in another location than the location you saw in the video and film clips that I've presented so far. We formed Pharos Technologies and moved John's apparatus to a completely independent, neutral place in a disused warehouse that had a mezzanine floor. We were able to obtain a contract from a number of people working in the U.S. military establishment who became aware of the Hutchison Effect and were interested in trying to see whether the effect could be exploited for a number of uses, both civilian and military. This was in the early 1980s, as I said, and Alexis Pezarro and myself were in touch with several people in both the U.S. and the Canadian government. And what I'm going to show is some photographs of the setup that was our second phase, you might say, that you've seen so far. We call it the Phase 1 setup that Pharos was involved with, and that was in another location in a warehouse in Vancouver, British Columbia. And if we can take a look now at some of the photographs that were taken during the time, we see the general setup of the lab space that we had rented. There's a mezzanine floor here, and above it we located a number of ping pong balls suspended from strings in order to see whether there was activity going on above the room in which the apparatus was set up. And there are the double doors into which you can look and see John's arm just there controlling some of the pieces of apparatus. Here are a number of people from some laboratories, national labs in the United States, as well as some military personnel. And there's Alexis Pezarro there talking to one of the people. We were outside the lab in which some of the effects had been taking place. Unfortunately, during the time that these gentlemen were up from the U.S., the equipment did not function properly. In fact, one of its own transformers, it blew up, and we were not able to effect a successful test. However, I have some other photos here that show the inside of the lab. There's the disruptive discharge coil there, the large Tesla coil here, with the field shaping coil ball behind it, and the Van de Graaff sits up there and above, and there's the active area down there where we have placed several pieces of material, and only very slight motions were detected during this demonstration. It's another photograph from the same time, and it's a bigger overview. There's the Tesla coil, the large Tesla coil here. The small Tesla coil is just out of sight on a table back here, and there are a number of tank circuits with capacitors and inductors, and various spark gaps going on here, large masses, transformers, etc., all over the place, and a great jumble of wires which we put together, in fact I put together, based on the activity that I recorded in John's initial laboratory, which you've seen earlier in this video presentation. Also, in this photo you can see the small Tesla coil powered by the 807 triodes, and a number of ping pong balls we brought down into the active area to see what was going on. We had very good effects, including the bending of that molybdenum rod, which I showed you earlier, up until the time just before our guests arrived from the U.S. and the system blew up one of its own transformers. Subsequent to that, we also tried to involve Canadian government personnel in the latter part of 1984-85 period, and they came to attempt to witness some of the unusual effects going on, but unfortunately weren't able to stay long enough to see the effects in action. So we were stymied in a way in that we could never get a demonstration going for a number of people. To show you what the setup was in this laboratory space, we will now switch to a physical layout diagram. And over here you can see the layout as it was, 30 feet from there to there approximately. There are the double doors, and the photograph that you saw was looking into these doors here. And John would sit here and adjust the main tuning coils and capacitors there. There are a number of spark gaps and tank circuits and inductors along this wall. The double-ended or dumbbell Tesla coil hung from the ceiling here. The large Tesla coil was here, and the small Tesla coil, the twin 807 triode Tesla coil, was there, and the active area was in there, right between. This distance was about 6 to 8 feet from there to there and from there to there. Field shaper was there, and the Van de Graaff was there. Sparking gap there, and disruptive discharge coil. The main supply was over here, which provided the 10 to 20 kilovolt DC supply to some of these other components. And from time to time, John would put in a small radioactive source of depleted uranium for some unknown reason way over here. And whether or not that had anything to do with the phenomena, we are not entirely sure. This was the setup that I put together with Alexis Pezarro's help, and we brought John in to operate the system, and indeed we did get quite a few interesting results, but unfortunately it decided to blow itself up before, or one of the transformers decided to give way just before a critical demonstration, so we weren't able to attract a significant amount of funding to develop the Hutchison Effect further the way that we wanted to. During the mid-1980s, John was involved with several other groups, including some demonstrations that he performed in the lab setup after the one you just saw for some personnel from the U.S. aerospace industry. Unfortunately, during those demonstrations, only a very small amount of motion occurred, and it wasn't significant enough, apparently, in the eyes of the people who were witnessing the video to spring significant funds for a full-scale investigation of the Hutchison Effect. Pharos Technologies ended its formal relationship with John Hutchison in 1986, and the rest of this video will document some of the activity that took place in the 1988-1989 timeframe when John was associated with another company, a Vancouver company, and you'll see some very interesting activity that took place after John set up the apparatus in yet another location in 1988.
The Hutchison Effect, Part E.1, Later Results plus Demonstrations from 1988 to 1989. New business venture, new lab setup, demonstrations for TV news, Japanese UFO program, end of business venture and lab, and the current status.
During the period from 1986 to 1988, John found another location for his laboratory, as shown here, and he was able to put quite a bit of his equipment into a very restricted space, as he had done in the very first lab setup in the house basement in Lynn Valley, British Columbia. And in this photograph, you can see John in the center here, looking out over the active area where some samples are placed on a yellow milk carton. And there are shelves and shelves of surplus electronic equipment here which have nothing to do directly with the effect, but act as large masses which reflect electromagnetic energy back and forth and around the active area. You can just see part of John's Tesla coil down here that he was using in the previously shown videos, and part of the Van de Graaff generator right there, the lower part. This is in the, as I say, the 1986 to 1988 period, after myself, George Hathaway, and Alexis Pezarro in Pharos Corporation had stopped negotiations with John, as the contract that we had with John its time had run out. And here are some other photographs of the apparatus in this new laboratory in the 1986 to 1988 time frame. And we see a great jumble of material, but once again, there's the dumbbell or double-ended Tesla coil up here, and the top of the large Tesla coil that seems to be a ubiquitous feature of the Hutchison apparatus, as well as the Van de Graaff generator, which has a top capacity of about a foot in diameter and is probably capable of producing, say, 1.5, 200,000, perhaps even 250,000 volts. And now we see various other bits of apparatus in the setup, including this very large diameter secondary Tesla coil and various other masses and balls around. Here's another shot as well of the apparatus with a new device that he has slung from the ceiling, and various other pieces of apparatus, and the active area would be down in the corner down there. This apparatus produced some unusual effects, and most notably a demonstration for a CTV, a Canadian television network newscast clip that we will now show, and you will see the interviewer walking into this new lab setup and talking with John, and then a large foam block taking off in the background.
It looks like it came straight out of Baron von Frankenstein's castle. Hutchison is an amateur scientist who has devoted a good part of his adult life trying to prove out the theories of a controversial Yugoslavian physicist named Nikola Tesla. His lab is located in the basement of a nondescript store in Vancouver. Hutchison doesn't want to tell us, or doesn't want us to tell you where it is exactly. Working with huge jolts of electricity of up to 500,000 volts, Hutchison is tinkering with Tesla's central thesis that large amounts of power can be transmitted through the air without wires. One of the side effects of his experiments involves the levitation of inanimate objects. He cannot yet predict with any accuracy which objects will rise, when, or where, but they do rise, as you're about to see.
You enter the world of John Hutchison through an old bank vault door, revealing a museum-like atmosphere charged with electric energy. Hutchison sits at a hand-built control panel, fine-tuning equipment some feel might change the world.
I use these headsets here to monitor frequency changes, going by the static patterns that I hear. And down here, I'll adjust the magnetic flux, and I can feel the rhythms of the energy.
The rhythms of the energy are generated by an enormous jumble of strange-looking electronic equipment, much of it hand-built by Hutchison himself. Components include vacuum tubes, 40-year-old technology. Some of the equipment is modeled after that of turn-of-the-century physicist Nikola Tesla. Tesla developed alternating current, the electrical system used today. His experiments included the transmission of energy without wires. Some feel he was the greatest inventor of all time. Hutchison began by duplicating some of his early work.
Very similar to Tesla's experiments before the turn of the century, isn't it?
Yes, it is. He used very old-fashioned Geissler tubes. This is a modern neon tube.
Do you believe that ultimately electricity could be transmitted without wires over long distances?
I would think so by using vacuum tube oscillators.
That would do away with high-tension wires ultimately?
Yeah.
The Jacob's ladder effect is demonstrated just for fun. And other effects are duplicated in Hutchison's basement lab. But it was his love of old equipment that led to advanced experimentation.
This is an old dynamotor, turn of the century. And I got it from a scrap dealer. And it appears to be the same kind of motor that Tesla used in some of the experiments.
Hutchison's equipment combines recycled electronics in huge hand-built coils that together defy some established laws of physics.
That's a Tesla coil. In regards to Tesla, it would be probably a very small one. It can fit out about 1.5 million volts.
Did you build it?
Yeah.
How long did it take you to wind something like that?
It took me about a week to do the whole coil. The winding itself, I guess, about a day and a half.
Hutchison cranks up power of up to 500,000 volts, but the source is just one wall outlet. If he has developed a new source of energy, it uses very little power. He sets up metal and plastic objects in the area he feels things will move, but unexpected articles begin to fly. A sponge beyond the set takes off. Hutchison can't see it from his control panel and relies on our information.
That's very important that can you tell me how long it stayed up on the ceiling?
I would say a full second, 1 second, like that. It went up and hit the ceiling 1 second, maybe 2 seconds, and then came down.
You can't be kidding.
No. And it
I wonder how far.
slowly and deliberately went up, almost like a levitation. Do you know why this effect is caused?
I really don't. I have some ideas in my mind that the being electromagnetic in nature somehow is interfering with the gravitational pull of the Earth.
Shall we try it again?
I'd like to give her another shot.
Sure. Well, so do we. Good.
So I'll fire her up again. I hope we're lucky.
Watch the tinfoil here.
Hang in there.
The tinfoil just jumped. Just went up and flickered a bit and then dropped down.
Flickered?
Yeah, it just shook.
Hot dog.
Okay, I'll keep.
Nothing else was touching it. I was watching.
Okay, I'll keep operating, and maybe I'll get some metal breaking up.
He has indeed broken metal into fragments and lifted an entire snowplow. He just can't predict what will move. Hutchison doesn't know if it's the equipment alone or his effect on the equipment, but Canadian researchers are now discussing the Hutchison effect with physicists around the world, and it may lead to developments not even thought of yet.
Street has a graded education, but he claims he can do things U.S. government scientists have only dreamed of doing. Grant Fredericks visited the lab this afternoon and has some interesting observations.
When one walks off East Hastings Street in Burnaby into John Hutchison's world, one leaves behind the conventions of the 20th century and enters a scene more in common with something out of a Jules Verne science fiction novel. Hutchison, a 40-year-old hobby physicist, has placed bits of metal, including tinfoil, copper, and aluminum, within a target field. He says the objects will move by themselves. Hutchison claims to have reproduced the lab and experiments of the 19th century scientists who toyed with electromagnetic and gravitational force fields.
I had a great interest in the work of Nikola Tesla, the famous Yugoslavian physicist of the turn of the century that's responsible for radio, microwave energy, and other extremely interesting effects.
What are some of the more dramatic things that happened?
Levitation of 60-pound pieces of brass, and levitation of 25-pound pieces of steel, brass, wood, and some articles like a plow, hand-drawn plow. And
You've actually levitated them?
Yes, we have.
Hutchison didn't attend Harvard or Princeton, and he has never received any money for his experiments. In fact, he didn't get past the 8th grade, and he says he's been shunned by the Canadian scientific community. However, he says his experiments have captured the interests of the Pentagon, and he expects his experiment will soon be transferred to a modern laboratory in the United States.
Right here. There goes another chunk. Flew off the table. Great going.
While our camera watched, the articles in the target area did move, but nothing levitated or jumped off the table. Hutchison says their electromagnetic structure had changed. A skeptic might argue that vibrations from the powerful electric spark near the table may have caused the articles to vibrate themselves off the shelf. Grant Fredericks, First News, Burnaby.
That's that one of our
Thank you,
lights
Grant.
went.
Wherever you are.
The Canucks can become a winning team tonight if the Toronto Maple Leafs cooperate.
And it is
Video clips you've just witnessed were of a new laboratory that John had set up after Pharos Technologies had been out of the picture for a couple of years. John set this laboratory up and invited several film crews from newscasts in to witness the phenomena, and you saw the results just in those previous clips. Then he became involved with another group of businessmen in Vancouver, and he set up the lab once again in a new location, and it's the new location that you will see shortly. The new location, however, was short-lived, and as was the business relationship with the individuals and the company that John finally became involved with. And the clip that you're about to see shows some of the apparatus as it was set up in yet another laboratory setup with the new company that he was involved with. And finally, we will end this segment with a clip of some Japanese UFO program, which sent some interviewers over to talk to John. So now here's the last lab that was set up before the problems with the new company that John became involved with. And also, I should note that during one of the demonstrations that was going on with the new company, one of the transformers apparently exploded and sent some PCB-laden oil around the lab. The local environmental authorities came in and impounded a lot of the equipment due to the PCB spill, and so the government has put a bunch of John's equipment into storage bins, and he is not able to get at it, and yet he still maintains a small corpus of equipment that he is now experimenting with from time to time. and some of the other equipment is in the hands of other people and the company that he had become involved with. As of this date, 1993, to my knowledge, John is not involved with any other corporations, having last been involved with a company in 1989. And let's now take a look at the last lab setup, followed by the Japanese film footage.
Well, I know I'm a bit of an oddball, and I don't mind. I'm a bit eccentric and a little spinny, but I love it. But the scientists took me serious. I've had some contacts with the UBC, and they thought it was a little off the wall.
This maze of electrical devices is Hutchison's most promising invention. No one knows exactly how it works, but it apparently creates an electromagnetic field capable of moving objects from a distance.
Basically, it's a device that projects energy at a distance and affects test samples. It either bends them or breaks them up or lifts them up in the air or makes them go sideways.
Hutchison says he can't give a demonstration of this phenomenon right now. It would take a week to hook everything up, but his access to this room is limited. The equipment is being stored here only temporarily, and he may have to move it soon. Still, this amateur film shows what Hutchison claims his invention does. The objects you see are resting on a plastic milk carton close to his device. He says they rise in the air after he hits the switch, and sometimes metal objects simply bend or even break.
You're looking at something which you know shouldn't be happening.
Vancouver businessman Alexis Pezarro has seen Hutchison's project in action. In 1981, a company he helped form signed a deal with Hutchison. The company would promote Hutchison's discovery and work to develop it further.
I immediately realized that this had tremendous significance. It had significance in space, it had military implications, and its understanding could possibly open up a whole new energy source.
Pezarro's company, Ferris Technologies, did spark a lot of interest in Hutchison's discovery. In 1983, a United States Army team investigated the invention after putting up $25,000 in funding. But after the investigation, the funding ended. In 1986, Canada's Scientific and Technical Intelligence Branch examined Hutchison's creation. A letter written on the visit by the branch director concluded, "We do not foresee any further consideration of support, as the phenomenon appears to be intermittent and unpredictable." In each of the above cases, the parties have been attracted by the features of Hutchison's invention, namely that it can move objects around from a distance and has been seen to bend and fracture pieces of metal. But in each case, a big catch has put the interest in check. That catch is that the effects cannot be reproduced consistently. They only happen occasionally and by chance.
At this point in time, it can't be really of any practical use until it's worked on, cultivated into a continuous effect. And indeed, I got that information from the Canadian Defense Department.
With no sustained interest in the project, Hutchison and Ferris Technologies had some disagreements and have parted ways. And Hutchison now does his own promotion. He says the latest interest comes from a group of American scientists who have indicated they may set him up in Washington State or California. But Hutchison's not holding his breath. He says before he sees money and backing, any interest is just talk. And until then, his invention will remain a maze of apparently great potential. Cal Barton, CBC News, Vancouver.
そうですね、裏付けるかのような未知のエネルギーが使用されているのではないかという衝撃的な証言をキャッチしました。ご覧ください。
我々は今回貴重なビデオを手に入れた。この映像はおよそ10年前、ある電気的実験の最中に偶然起きた現象を捉えたものだという。
カナダのバンクーバーに住むジョン・ハチソンという研究者が、特殊な電気装置を使いまして、物体が、宙に浮き上がったりですね、金属がバラバラになったり、あるいはスプーンがですね、まるでもう念力をかけたように折れ曲がったり、そういった現象が、起きたということを聞いています。
ジョン・ハチソン氏が発見したことからハチソン効果と呼ばれているこの現象と UFO の飛行原理に関連性はありえないだろうか。我々はその可能性を確かめるためハチソン氏の住むバンクーバーへ飛んだ。部屋の中には研究を続けていた当時様々な形に変形あるいは切断された金属片が並べられていた。しかし、なぜ金属片がここまで変形してしまうのだろうか。
私は、電波信号や高電圧の分野を研究していたんですけれど、たまたまその実験の最中に、偶発的に物が宙に浮いてしまうという現象が起きたんです。その装置そのものは、高重力、つまり、重力に逆らうパワーを作り出すという実験装置です。
アメリカの軍だとか、政府が来て、研究資料を持ち去られたとか、研究を邪魔されたというふうに聞いたんですが、そういう事実はありますか？
はい。カナダ政府に12年間妨害され続けています。
彼はその現象を発表した直後、カナダ政府、米軍、ロスアラモス研究所などから様々なアプローチを受けたという。しかし、現象を解明する前に、何者かによってその研究資料や機材は全て持ち去られ、そして破壊されたという。
原理を、例えば未来的に使って、今いわゆる UFO と言われるような、今人間の理解できない飛行物体を作り出すということは可能だと思いますか？
Oh yeah, no question.
それはもう間違いなく作れますよ。もっと研究を重ねていけば、重力を思い通りにコントロールすることが可能になるはずです。
もし彼の理論が正しければ、新たな浮遊原理を持つ飛行物体が作り出せるかもしれない。がしかし、彼の研究データは、アメリカ軍、カナダ政府などの関係者によって持ち去られたという。この研究を一級の科学者たちが引き続き行っていたとしたら、すでに地球製 UFO は完成しているのかもしれない。
The Hutchison Effect, Part E.2, video of later effects from 1988 to 1989, levitation of conducting and insulating solids, levitation of semi-solids, levitation of liquid, metal fracturing, quote, jelly metal plasticization, quote, breathing bottles, bubbling liquids, smoking paper, and other miscellaneous phenomena.
The last segment shown of the Japanese UFO program depicted a number of objects flying up that haven't been previously seen, including a brown bowl and a blue plate and some substance in a cup. And these objects were levitating during the 1988-1989 laboratory setup. You also saw in that Japanese film clip a number of heavy objects that were broken up and disrupted, their molecular bonds destroyed, and those pieces of aluminum and steel were broken apart during that time as well. And this segment of the video is going to go into a little more detail on the levitation phenomena, that a bit of which you saw just a short while ago. And we'll be dividing the levitation phenomena into a number of different categories, including the levitation of conducting and insulating bodies, semi-solids, and liquids, as well as the fracturing of materials and the rippling kinds of effects that John got in metals, and ending up with some miscellaneous activity, including breathing bottles and bubbling liquids and things of that nature. So this next clip is going to be rather extended and show you some of the most amazing kinds of activity that, in fact, I've ever seen on video, and I trust you'll agree.
Note that George Hathaway never completed parts F, G, and H, instead focusing on John Hutchison's work. These last chapters were related to a 1988 Planetary Association for Clean Energy, or PACE, conference and proceedings. For Part E, George Hathaway included extended Hutchison Effect footage from 1988 to 1989. The full, unedited 1988 and 1989 footage can be viewed on my @MES YouTube channel and through my Hutchison Effect playlist at mes.fm/Hutchison-playlist. I have instead compiled a highlight reel of the 1988 to 1989 Hutchison Effect footage, which will play now for the remainder of this video.
see how that turns out. Well, sorry I didn't lift anything really heavy, but that doesn't matter. They already can do that now. And most likely in a very effective manner. Directed energy research, biggest thing going. Okay, folks. Adios.